This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The golden throne of the great empire was never meant to be a seat of comfort. It was a pedestal of absolute frozen isolation. For decades, Emperor Severian Kael ruled with a logic so sharp it could draw blood from stone. His heart a fortress of iron and ancient grief. To him, people were not souls to be known, but assets to be managed or liabilities to be discarded. On the day he stood before the heavy iron gates of the capital, his eyes fell upon a figure that represented everything he despised: weakness, silence, and the heavy weight of an unwanted existence. Elara Mine stood there, trembling in a dress of faded linen, her eyes downcast as the elders offered her to him as a symbolic bridge to the common people. To the world, she was a ghost in the making, a girl who had spent her life being pushed from one cold hand to another, never belonging, never chosen, and always, always invisible. Severian did not see a woman. He saw a blemish on the perfection of his calculated reign. With a voice that carried the chill of a winter midnight, he uttered the words that would echo through the marble halls for years to come, rejecting her not with anger, but with a devastating indifference that was far more cruel. He told the court that he had no use for a girl whose only inheritance was sorrow, effectively casting her back into a world that had already closed its doors to her. As he turned his back, his heavy velvet cloak sweeping the floor like a closing curtain, he felt the satisfaction of a man who had purged a flaw from his sight. Elara did not cry out, nor did she beg. She simply faded back into the shadows of the city, carrying the weight of the emperor's public disdain as her final, heaviest burden. It was meant to be the end of a trivial chapter, a brief interruption in the grand history of a sovereign who believed himself to be a god among men. But as the months passed, a strange and quiet rot began to seep into the foundations of the palace, and the silence Elara left behind became louder than the cheers of 10,000 soldiers. Severian found himself staring at the empty space where she had stood, haunted by the memory of a dignity he couldn't break and a pair of eyes that had looked at him not with fear, but with a terrifying, silent understanding. The empire remained vast, and his power remained absolute, yet his nights grew longer, and the golden halls felt increasingly like a tomb of his own making. He had rejected the girl no one wanted, believing he was protecting his strength, but in doing so, he had unknowingly severed the last thread of humanity that connected him to the earth. Now, as whispers of dissent began to stir in the provinces and the air in the throne room grew thin, the great emperor realized with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that his crown was growing heavy and his throne was starting to crumble under the weight of a single, irreversible regret. Before we continue this journey of power and redemption, I'd like to extend a special invitation. If this story is touching your heart, and you want to discover how Severian's empire will deal with the weight of silence, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Leave a like so more people can discover this narrative, and comment below. What would you do if you discovered, too late, that you rejected the only person who could save you? Severian Kael was not merely a man. He was the very map of an empire that knew no borders, a force of nature dressed in silk and black armor. From his youth, he had been taught that a ruler's heart must be a desert where no seed of weakness can sprout. He walked through the marble corridors of the palace with steps that echoed like death sentences, and his gaze, cold as the steel of imperial swords, never lingered on anything that was not strategically relevant. For Severian, life was an eternal chess game, where every emotion was a piece to be sacrificed in the name of the throne's stability, and he prided himself on never having felt the tremor of doubt or the warmth of a real human connection. Elara, on the other hand, was the opposite of everything the empire represented. She was the personification of silent survival in a world that screamed for importance. Raised in the forgotten corners of the capital, where sunlight rarely reached the damp stones of the alleys, she learned early on that her voice had no weight, and that her existence was a statistical error. She possessed no jewels, no lineage, or promises of a future. Only a soft resilience that allowed her to walk among wolves without being devoured. While the emperor was the blinding sun at the top of the mountain, Elara was the mist that rested in the valley, persistent, calm, and absolutely ignored by everyone who passed by in search of gold. The first time their worlds collided, The atmosphere in the central courtyard of the palace was thick with the scent of incense and the expectation of a secular political ritual. Severian was there to accept the offerings of the provinces, a gesture of submission he received with ill-disguised boredom, until the crowd parted to reveal the young orphan girl. She had been brought as a symbol of charity, an attempt by the elders to show that the emperor cared for even the humblest. But what Severian saw was not a noble cause. He saw a distraction, a creature who seemed too fragile to breathe the same air as the generals and advisors surrounding the throne, someone who brought no taxes or glory, only a mute need to be seen. Severian's internal wound, hidden beneath layers of unshakable authority, reacted violently to Elara's presence. He despised in her what he most feared in himself, the vulnerability of having no control over one's own destiny, the possibility of being discarded by the flow of history. Looking at that girl in simple robes and calloused hands, he felt no pity, but an instinctive repulsion that masked a curiosity he refused to name. To him, Elara represented the chaos of affection, something he had buried deep after the betrayal and loss that shaped his rise to power, and rejecting her was, in his mind, the final act of purifying his own sovereign soul. The moment of rejection was orchestrated with surgical precision, intended to be a lesson in pragmatism for the entire court that watched in absolute silence. When Severian declared that the empire had no place for purposeless burdens, he was not just speaking to Elara, but reaffirming his commitment to the coldness that kept him at the top. He watched for a brief second as the words hit the girl, expecting to see her crumble or beg for mercy, something that would confirm his superiority. Instead, what he received was a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the sound of the palace fountains, a look from Elara that held no hatred, but a sad acceptance that disturbed him more than any insult ever could. In the days following the rejection, a strange stillness settled over the imperial court, a quiet that felt heavy and unearned. Severian returned to his duties with a renewed intensity, signing decrees and commanding armies as if to drown out the memory of the girl's steady gaze. He convinced himself that the encounter had been a mere footnote in a glorious reign, yet he found his eyes drifting toward the iron gates every time he crossed the courtyard. He told himself he was checking for security breaches, but in the deepest, most guarded chambers of his mind, he was looking for a flicker of linen or a shadow that didn't belong. The city continued to pulse below the palace walls, but for the first time in 20 years, the emperor felt a prickle of irritation at the sheer anonymity of his subjects. Elara moved through the city like a ghost that had forgotten how to haunt, her heart wrapped in a shroud of quiet dignity. She did not speak of the emperor's cruelty to the other orphans or the street vendors who shared their scraps with her. She simply carried the weight of his words as if they were a physical scar. To her, the rejection was not a surprise, but a finality that brought a hollow kind of peace, a confirmation that she truly belonged to no one and nothing. She spent her hours in the old library's ruins, cleaning dust from forgotten scrolls, finding more comfort in the company of dead words than in the living world that had turned its back on her. She did not realize that by accepting her invisibility so completely, she had become the only person in the empire who was truly free from Severian's reach. Back within the gilded cage of the throne room, the emperor's advisors began to notice a shift in his temperament, a hairline fracture in his legendary composure. He grew impatient with the flattery of the nobles and the endless petitions for power, finding their greed predictable and their loyalty transparently thin. During the long, candle-lit council meetings, he would find his thoughts wandering to the concept of purpose, the very word he had used to discard Elara. He began to wonder what purpose his own life served, if it was merely a cycle of maintaining walls and counting gold, a thought that felt like treason against his own crown. The fortress he had built around his heart was not being attacked from the outside, but was slowly being hollowed out by the echo of a girl who had asked for nothing. The rejection had intended to erase her, but instead, it had etched her absence into the very stone of the palace. Severian started to suffer from a peculiar insomnia, a restlessness that drove him to walk the ramparts alone at night, looking down at the flickering lights of the capital. He found himself imagining her among those lights, wondering if she was cold, if she was hungry, or if she even remembered the man who had dismissed her with such calculated disdain. This burgeoning obsession was not born of love. He did not believe in such things, but of a desperate need to understand why her silence felt more powerful than his commands. He was the master of all he surveyed, yet he could not command his own mind to stop searching for a face he had sworn was beneath his notice. As winter began to breathe its first frost onto the empire, the disconnect between the emperor and his court deepened into a silent chasm. The lavish banquets felt tasteless, and the music sounded like discordant noise to a man who was suddenly tuned to a different frequency of existence. He realized that in his quest for absolute power, he had eliminated every voice that would dare to speak a truth that wasn't polished for his ears. Elara had been that truth, a raw, unvarnished piece of humanity that owed him nothing and expected even less. The realization began to gnaw at him, a slow-acting poison that made the gold of his throne feel cold and the weight of his crown feel like a leaden shackle, signaling the beginning of a descent he was not yet ready to admit. The weeks turned into a season of hushed whispers, and the emperor found himself making a decision that defied his own logic. Under the cover of a simple traveler's cloak, Severian began to venture into the lower districts of the city, a place he had not set foot in since his coronation. He told himself it was an inspection of the infrastructure, a way to ensure his subjects were being managed, but his feet led him toward the ruined library where rumors said the ghost girl resided. He found Elara sitting on a stone bench, mending a torn book by the light of a single sputtering candle. She looked smaller than he remembered, yet the air around her seemed to carry a stillness that his palace lacked, a sense of belonging to herself that he, for all his provinces, had never truly achieved. He did not approach her at first, standing instead in the deep shadows of a crumbling archway, watching her move with a grace that was born of necessity rather than training. She worked with a focus that made the rest of the world fall away, her fingers moving delicately over the ancient parchment as if she were healing a living thing. Severian felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since the death of his mother, the last person who had ever looked at him without calculating his value. He realized that Elara was not just a girl he had rejected. She was a mirror reflecting the absolute poverty of his own soul. While he had everything and felt nothing, she had nothing, and yet seemed to hold a universe of quiet purpose within her small, determined hands. When a group of local ruffians approached her, seeking to mock the girl who had been publicly shamed by the crown, Severian felt a surge of protective rage that nearly broke his disguise. He watched as Elara didn't flinch, didn't cry, and didn't beg. She simply looked at them with a profound pity that made the men stumble over their own insults and eventually walk away in confused silence. She possessed a strength that didn't require a sword or an army, a moral gravity that pulled at the emperor's very foundations. He saw then that her weakness was actually a shield of pure authenticity, and it made his own armor feel like a hollow shell. He left the shadows that night without speaking to her, but the seed of a dangerous, transformative obsession had been planted in the fertile soil of his growing regret. Back in the solitude of his private chambers, Severian looked at his reflection in a mirror of polished silver and saw a stranger. The lines of his face were hard, etched by years of making choices that favored the many over the one, the structure over the spirit. He began to question the very pillars of his education, the voices of his tutors who had told him that a king must be a monolith. If he was so powerful, why did the image of a girl mending a book haunt him more than the threat of a border war? He felt a sudden, violent urge to tear down the tapestries and shatter the statues, to strip away the gold until he found the man he used to be before the crown had calcified his heart. The rejection was no longer a moment in the past. It was a living, breathing entity that followed him through the halls, whispering that he had made a mistake he might never be able to fix. The isolation of the throne became an unbearable weight as the first snow began to fall, dusting the capital in a deceptive white purity. Severian found himself calling for Elara's file, searching for a history that didn't exist, a lineage that ended in blanks and question marks. She was a void in his records, just as she was becoming a void in his life, a space that should have been filled with something other than cold ambition. He realized that by casting her out, he had cast out the only chance he had to be seen as a man rather than a title. The realization was a slow, agonizing burn, a fire that started in the center of his pride and began to consume the certainty of his reign, leaving him standing on the precipice of a choice that would either save his soul or destroy his empire. The heavy winter air seemed to settle into the very marrow of Severian's bones, and for the first time in his life, the emperor felt the bite of the cold. He realized that the warmth of his palace was artificial, a heat generated by burning wood and coal, while his inner world remained a frozen wasteland. Driven by a compulsion he could no longer suppress, he ordered his captain of the guard to find Elara and bring her to the palace, not as a commoner, but as a guest of the crown. The order sent ripples of shock through the administration, a silent alarm that the emperor's iron logic was beginning to warp. When she finally arrived, she was wearing the same faded linen dress, her breath hitching in the grand hallway, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and a wary, lingering pain that made Severian want to look away. He didn't know how to speak to her without the shield of his authority, so he spoke to her as a monarch, assigning her to work in the imperial archives. It was a forced proximity, a way to keep her within his orbit without admitting he needed her presence to feel grounded. Elara accepted the position with a silent nod, her movements around the palace like those of a bird trapped in a golden cage. She never sought his gaze, never spoke unless spoken to, and went about her tasks with a terrifyingly humble diligence. Severian would watch her from the high balconies as she crossed the gardens, a small, solitary figure against the vast, oppressive architecture of his ancestors, and he felt the walls of his own heart begin to itch with the need to break the silence he himself had created. The tension between them was a living thing, a thin wire stretched to the breaking point in every room they shared. Severian found excuses to visit the archives, ostensibly to check on ancient treaties, but his eyes would always find her, tucked away in a corner with a quill in hand. One afternoon, he stood over her as she worked, the scent of old paper and lavender, her scent, filling the narrow aisle. He wanted to apologize, to tell her that his rejection had been a defense mechanism of a dying ego, but the words felt too large for his throat. Instead, he reached out to touch a stray strand of her hair, his hand trembling with a vulnerability that would have horrified his generals. Elara froze, her shoulders tensing, and in that moment of forced stillness, the power dynamic shifted. He was the one pleading, and she was the one with the power to grant peace. As the days of forced coexistence stretched into weeks, Severian began to notice the small, quiet ways Elara changed the atmosphere of the palace. She would leave wildflowers in the vases of the cold stone hallways, and she spoke to the servants as if they were her equals, bringing a flicker of genuine life to a place that had functioned like a clockwork machine. These small gestures were like cracks in a dam, allowing a trickle of humanity to seep into the emperor's rigid routine. He found himself softening, his voice losing its jagged edge when he addressed his staff, and his decisions becoming less about cold numbers and more about the people they affected. He was being dismantled by her mere existence, his defenses crumbling not under a siege of fire, but under the gentle pressure of her quiet, unyielding grace. Yet, the ghost of his initial rejection remained a jagged glass wall between them, a reminder of the day he had publicly declared her worthless. Elara's compliance was not forgiveness. It was the habit of someone who had learned to survive the whims of the powerful. Severian realized that while he had brought her body back to the palace, her spirit remained far out of his reach, drifting in the sea of the unwanted where he had cast her. He began to understand that power could buy presence, but it could never buy the type of look she gave the dust motes dancing in the sun, a look of pure, untainted wonder. He was the great emperor, the man who owned everything, yet he was starving for a single, authentic smile from the girl he had told the world he didn't want. The silence between them became a battlefield of unspoken truths, where every shared glance felt like a heavy weight pressing against Severian's chest. He began to find reasons to keep her near him during the late hours of the night, asking her to read aloud the histories of kings long dead, just so he could hear the steady, rhythmic cadence of her voice. Elara obeyed, but she read with a detachment that cut deeper than any blade, her voice devoid of the warmth she gave to the stray cats in the courtyard or the elderly librarians. Severian would sit in his high-backed chair, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across his face, realizing that he was a man who could order the execution of thousands, but could not command a single ounce of affection from the girl sitting 5 feet away. One evening, as a sudden storm rattled the stained glass windows of the study, Severian watched Elara flinch at a particularly violent crack of thunder. Without thinking, he rose from his seat and moved toward her, his hand hovering over her shoulder before he pulled it back, remembering the coldness he had once used as a weapon against her. He saw her eyes flicker to his hand, a brief moment of raw terror crossing her features that made him feel like a monster in his own home. "I am not here to hurt you, Elara," he whispered, his voice sounding foreign even to his own ears. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the leather binding of the book, but she replied in a soft, hollow tone that her only fear was that she was still a burden he was forcing himself to endure. The words felt like a physical blow to his stomach, a reminder of the toxic legacy of his own pride. He realized that in her mind, she was still the purposeless burden he had branded her, and no amount of palace luxury could erase the stain of that initial public execution of her spirit. To bridge the gap, Severian began to perform small, anonymous acts of service, things a king should never do. He would sharpen her quills when she was away, or leave the rarest, sweetest fruits from the southern provinces on her desk. He did these things in secret, like a thief in his own treasury, terrified that if she knew they came from him, she would see them as another form of manipulation rather than the desperate offerings of a repentant soul. Elara was not blind to the changes, but she was deeply afraid to trust them. She had lived her entire life waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the moment when the kindness of others would turn into a demand or a debt she couldn't pay. When she found the fruits or the perfectly mended tools, she felt a confusing mix of gratitude and dread, wondering if the Emperor was playing a new, more psychological game with her. She would watch him during the formal council sessions, seeing the way he struggled to maintain his mask of indifference, while his eyes constantly sought her out in the shadows of the gallery. She saw a man who was at war with himself, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than pain. She felt a dangerous, budding curiosity for the man behind the crown. The tension reached a breaking point during the midwinter gala, a night of forced celebration where the elite of the empire gathered to flaunt their status. Severian, dressed in his full regalia of gold and obsidian, felt a profound sense of disgust for the opulence surrounding him. He saw Elara standing by a pillar, dressed in a simple but elegant gown he had ordered for her, looking like a pearl lost in a sea of broken glass. When a drunken nobleman made a disparaging comment about her presence, calling her the Emperor's stray, Severian didn't hesitate. He crossed the room with a predatory grace, his presence silencing the music, and in front of the entire court, he took Elara's hand. He didn't say a word, but the look he gave the nobleman promised a slow and agonizing ruin, signaling to everyone that the girl no one wanted was now the only thing the Emperor protected. The silence that followed the Emperor's public display of protection was not one of peace, but of a simmering, dangerous electricity. By taking Elara's hand, Severian had shattered the most sacred rule of his own reign. He had shown a preference that was not rooted in politics, but in something far more volatile. As he led her away from the prying eyes of the court and into the moonlit gardens, he could feel the frantic pulse in her wrist against his palm. He realized then that he was holding something more precious and fragile than any province he had ever conquered. The cold air of the night bit at them, but for the first time, Severian did not feel the chill. He only felt the weight of the apology that had been rotting in his throat for months. They stopped near a frozen fountain, the white marble glowing like bone under the winter moon. Severian let go of her hand, feeling the sudden loss of contact like a physical ache. Elara stood before him, her breath curling in the air like smoke, her eyes searching his face with a mixture of disbelief and a budding, terrifying hope. "Why do you do this, my lord?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper that carried the weight of years of neglect. "Why protect a shadow you once tried to erase?" The question was a jagged blade, and for once the Emperor did not reach for his shield. He looked at her, his posture losing the rigid formality of a sovereign, admitting to himself that the man who had rejected her was a stranger he no longer wished to know. "I did not protect you to save your reputation, Elara," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "I did it because the thought of you being hurt is the only thing that still has the power to make me bleed." It was a confession of absolute vulnerability, a surrender of the ironclad ego that had defined his life. He watched her reaction, expecting her to flee from the intensity of his words, but instead, she took a small, tentative step toward him. In the stillness of the garden, the distance between the most powerful man in the world and the girl the world had discarded seemed to vanish, replaced by a shared recognition of their mutual solitude. They were two broken halves of a mirror, finally reflecting one another in the dark. But even as this bridge was being built, the foundations of the empire were beginning to groan under the strain of his distraction. Severian's enemies, sensing the softening of his heart, began to move in the shadows of the capital. Rumors spread that the emperor had been bewitched by a commoner, that his judgment was clouded by a girl of no consequence. These whispers were like termites in the wood of the throne, weakening his authority at a time when he needed it most. Severian knew the risks. He knew that by choosing to see Elara, he was making himself a target, but the cost of returning to his previous coldness was a price he was no longer willing to pay. He would rather rule a crumbling kingdom with her by his side than an eternal empire in the dark. Elara felt the shift in the palace air, a new kind of tension that was directed not at her, but at the man who had become her silent guardian. She saw the way the guards looked at him with confusion, and the way the ministers spoke in hushed, urgent tones when he entered a room. She realized that her presence was no longer just a personal matter. It was a political liability that could cost him everything he had spent a lifetime building. For the first time, she felt a different kind of fear. Not for her own survival, but for the safety of the man who had finally made her feel visible. The girl who had once been a burden to no one was now the weight that might bring down a god. The days following the gala were marked by a deceptive calm, a stillness that preceded a storm. Severian found himself inviting Elara to the high balconies not to work, but simply to exist in the same space. He would point out the constellations he had studied as a lonely child, sharing secrets of the stars that he had never whispered to a single soul. For a brief moment, the emperor forgot the crown on his head and the knives in the dark, finding a strange, terrifying peace in the way Elara listened to him. She didn't look at him as a ruler of millions. She looked at him as a man whose soul was covered in ancient dust, and her presence was the gentle wind beginning to blow it away. Yet this newfound intimacy was being watched by eyes that held no mercy. The High Council, led by men who had grown rich under Severian's cold pragmatism, saw Elara as a virus infecting the heart of their strength. They didn't see a girl. They saw a weakness that could be exploited to seize the throne for themselves. While Severian was distracted by the warmth of a human connection, the borders of his empire began to fray, and the logistics of his reign started to fail. Reports of minor uprisings were buried by his advisors, hidden from his view, to ensure he remained focused on his distraction. The trap was being set, not with armies, but with the very silence he had once cherished. In the quiet of the archives, Elara sensed the encroaching rot. She noticed how the servants whispered when she passed, their faces filled with a pity that felt different from the disdain of the past. She realized that by being chosen by the emperor, she had become the target of a collective hatred she hadn't asked for. One evening, she found a note tucked into one of the ancient ledgers, a jagged warning that her life was the price of the emperor's throne. It told her that as long as she stayed, his power would continue to bleed out until there was nothing left but a man without a kingdom. The weight of this realization crushed her, making the luxury of the palace feel like a suffocating shroud. Severian, unaware of the specific threats, felt only the deepening of his need to protect her. He began to disregard his council meetings entirely, spending his hours ensuring Elara's safety and comfort. He brought her rare books and fabrics from the Silk Road, trying to make up for a lifetime of rejection with a few weeks of indulgence. But the more he gave, the more distant she seemed to become. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes when they were alone, a fear he couldn't understand. He thought he was building a sanctuary for her, but in reality, he was building a target. His love, born of regret, was becoming the very weapon his enemies would use to destroy them both. The block ended with a moment of chilling clarity. During a private dinner, Severian reached across the table to touch Elara's hand, only to find it cold and trembling. He looked into her eyes and saw a goodbye he wasn't ready to hear. "They will kill you because of me," she whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence of the room. Severian tightened his grip, his eyes flashing with the old, dangerous fire of a conqueror. He realized then that the empire he had built was no longer his primary concern. If the throne had to fall for her to breathe, he was finally willing to watch it burn, but the cost of that choice was about to become agonizingly real. The threat Elara whispered was not a mere fear. It was a prophecy that began to manifest in the very air they breathed. Severian felt the shifting tides within his own walls, noticing how his most trusted commanders now avoided his gaze, their loyalty curdling into a calculated silence. He realized that by humanizing himself through Elara, he had stripped away the myth of his divinity, leaving behind a man who could be hurt, and therefore, a man who could be replaced. The irony was a bitter pill. The more he tried to secure her world, the more he destabilized his own. Every gesture of affection toward her was viewed by his court as a brick removed from the fortress of the empire, and the sound of the crumbling foundation was becoming impossible to ignore. As the political pressure mounted, Severian's internal conflict reached a fever pitch, tearing at the remains of his stoicism. He found himself caught in a devastating paradox. To save Elara's life, he might have to reject her again, sending her away to a place where his enemies could not find her. But the thought of her returning to the cold anonymity of her past, believing she was once again unwanted, was a torture he could not endure. He paced his chambers, the weight of the crown literally causing his neck to ache, wondering if he had the strength to be the monster the Empire required, or the man that Elara deserved. His power, once his greatest pride, now felt like a cage that prevented him from reaching for the only hand that mattered. Elara, seeing the toll her presence was taking on the man she had begun to secretly love, made a decision born of her own brand of quiet strength. She began to distance herself, not out of fear for her own life, but out of a desperate desire to preserve his. She would decline his invitations to the gardens and keep her eyes fixed on her work when he entered the archives, hoping that if she became invisible once more, the world would stop trying to tear him down. She wept in the darkness of her room, mourning a relationship that hadn't even fully begun, realizing that for a girl like her, being chosen by an emperor was not a fairy tale, but a death sentence for his glory. The first physical strike came not from an assassin's blade, but from a strategic betrayal at the border. A province rose in rebellion, funded by the very counselors who sat at Severian's table, a move designed to force the emperor away from the capital and away from Elara. Severian saw the move for what it was, a lure to leave his heart unguarded, and yet he could not ignore the duty of his office without admitting total defeat. He stood in the war room, surrounded by maps and cold-eyed generals, feeling the trap closing in. He was being forced to choose between his legacy and his soul, and for the first time, the great emperor felt the cold, creeping sensation of true helplessness. On the night before his departure for the front, Severian sought Elara out in the quietest corner of the palace. He didn't speak of war or politics. He simply took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that broke her resolve. "They think they are taking me away from you," he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "But they do not understand that I carry the silence of your heart into every battle I fight." He gave her a small iron key, not to a chest of gold, but to a hidden passage that led out of the city. It was a preparation for the worst, a silent admission that the throne was no longer a safe place for either of them, marking the beginning of the true collapse. The departure of the emperor left the palace feeling like a hollow ribcage, stripped of its vital heart. Severian rode toward the rebellion with a ferocity that bordered on madness, his every strike against the insurgents fueled by a desperate need to return and secure Elara's safety. But as he fought on the muddy fields of the frontier, he realized that the real war was being waged in the corridors he had left behind. His absence was the vacuum his enemies had waited for, and the silence he had once cultivated now became a weapon used to isolate Elara. Without his physical presence to shield her, she was once again the girl no one wanted, but with the added weight of being the girl the Empire blamed for its sudden instability. Back in the capital, the air grew thick with a calculated malice. Elara found herself barred from the library, her small comforts stripped away by the high-ranking officials who now acted as the city's de facto rulers. They didn't use violence, they used the cold, institutional neglect she knew so well, making her feel like a ghost in a house that was actively being exorcised. She clutched the iron key Severian had given her, the cold metal a constant reminder of his promise and his fear. She could hear the whispers in the servants' quarters, rumors that the emperor was losing the war, that he was being punished by the gods for elevating a commoner, and that the only way to save the empire was to remove the curse that had distracted him. The psychological toll on Elara was devastating, as she began to believe the lies being woven around her. She looked at the crumbling state of the city from her window and felt a soul-crushing guilt, wondering if her silent desire to be seen had indeed brought a curse upon the man who had looked at her. She saw herself through the eyes of the angry mobs gathering at the palace gates, not as a woman, but as a symbol of a king's decadence and a throne's decay. The resilience she had built over a lifetime of rejection began to crack, not because she was being hurt, but because the person she loved was being destroyed by the mere fact of her existence. Severian, meanwhile, discovered that the rebellion was a phantom, a series of skirmishes designed to keep him wandering the outskirts while his power was dismantled at the core. When he received word that the High Council was preparing a decree to strip Elara of her guest status and return her to the streets, his blood turned to ice. He realized then that he had been played like a novice on a chessboard. He abandoned his carriage and his honor guards, taking only his fastest horse and riding back toward the capital through a freezing rain that felt like needles against his skin. He wasn't riding to save his crown. He was riding to prevent the world from rejecting her a second time, knowing that if he failed, his throne would not just crumble, it would vanish. The night he returned, the palace was bathed in the flickering orange light of torches, the gates guarded by men whose loyalties were no longer certain. Severian didn't enter through the main hall. He used the very secret passages he had shown Elara, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached her chambers only to find them tossed and empty, the smell of lavender replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. The iron key he had given her lay on the floor, discarded in a rush. In that moment, the great emperor felt a void open up beneath him that no empire could fill. He had spent his life rejecting others to stay powerful, only to find that the ultimate rejection, being too late to save the one who saw him, was the only thing capable of breaking him. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Severian in a way that no battlefield ever had. He stood in the center of Elara's ransacked room, clutching the discarded iron key until the metal bit into his palm, drawing a thin line of blood. For the first time, the emperor felt the true weight of his crown, and it felt like a tombstone. He realized that his enemies hadn't just taken her. They had tried to erase the small sanctuary of humanity he had finally allowed himself to possess. Every shadow in the palace now seemed to mock him, whispering that a man who had spent decades rejecting the world deserved to be left with nothing but the dust of his own ambition. He moved through the hidden corridors like a predatory ghost, his eyes burning with a dark, focused rage. He found his way to the sub-basement of the palace, where the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the echoes of ancient secrets. There, in a small, windowless cell, meant for the lowest of traitors, he found Elara. She was huddled in a corner, her white gown stained with grime, her eyes wide and unfocused. She didn't look up when the door groaned open. She simply pulled her knees tighter to her chest, as if she were trying to become small enough to disappear entirely. The sight of her shattered dignity was a knife to Severian's heart, a visceral reminder of the day he had first turned his back on her. Severian didn't speak. He simply knelt in the filth beside her and pulled her into his arms. He felt her flinch, a reflex of a soul that had learned to expect only blows from the powerful, but he didn't let go. He held her with a desperate, trembling strength, burying his face in her hair as he let out a jagged breath that sounded like a sob. "I am here," he whispered, the words cracking in the silence of the dungeon. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let them take you again." Elara finally looked at him, and the hollow emptiness in her gaze began to fill with a terrifying, agonizing recognition. She didn't cry. She simply reached out and touched the gold embroidery on his sleeve, a gesture of profound, tragic connection. The realization of his own failure began to corrode Severian's sense of self. He had believed that his power made him a protector, but he saw now that his power was the very thing that had endangered her. He was the sun, and she was a flower he had accidentally scorched by trying to bring her too close. As he carried her out of the darkness and into the dim light of the secret passage, he felt the eyes of his ancestors watching from the portraits on the walls, judging him for his weakness. But Severian no longer cared for their judgment. He realized that a throne built on the rejection of love was merely a chair in a graveyard, and he was finally ready to stop being a king if it meant he could finally be a man. However, the escape was only the beginning of a larger collapse. As they emerged into the palace gardens, they were met not by loyalists, but by the High Council and a line of drawn swords. The betrayal was complete. The Chancellor stepped forward, his face a mask of feigned regret, and informed Severian that he was being relieved of his duties for emotional instability and endangering the sovereignty of the state. Severian looked at the men he had once commanded, then at the girl trembling in his arms, and he realized that the empire he had built was already gone. It had died the moment he decided that Elara's life was worth more than his title, and as the guards closed in, he felt a strange, liberating sense of ruin. The standoff in the garden felt like the end of time itself, with the scent of crushed winter jasmine hanging heavy in the air. Severian stood his ground, his body a literal shield for Elara, while the men who had once bowed at his feet now held steel to his throat. He looked at the Chancellor, not with the fury of an emperor, but with the cold, crystalline clarity of a man who had finally seen through a lifelong illusion. He realized that these men did not love the Empire. They loved the shadow he cast, and now that he had stepped into the light of his own humanity, they were terrified of the reflection. The throne was not being taken from him. It was being revealed as the hollow, gilded cage it had always been. The Chancellor's voice was a rhythmic drone, listing the crimes of the Emperor as if they were reading a ledger of lost grain. He spoke of tradition, of the purity of the bloodline, and of the dangerous precedent of elevating a nameless orphan to the heights of the sovereign's heart. Every word was designed to make Elara feel like a stain on history, and Severian could feel her trembling against him, her spirit buckling under the weight of a shame that wasn't hers to carry. He tightened his grip on her, his fingers digging into the fabric of her torn dress, as if he could physically hold her soul together. He knew that if he surrendered now, they would not just kill her, they would erase the memory of her existence from the world. A sudden violent cough from the Chancellor broke the tension, and Severian noticed for the first time that the guards were not looking at their leaders with respect, but with a desperate, hungry fear. The city beyond the walls was in chaos, the people rioting not for a new king, but because the cold, calculated systems Severian had built were finally failing without his hand to guide them. The Empire was eating itself alive, a monster of Severian's own making that had finally run out of enemies and turned on its creator. He felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that the world his enemies so desperately wanted to steal was already turning to ash in their mouths. It was the ultimate irony of absolute power. Once the heart is removed, the body cannot survive. Elara finally found her voice, a small but steady sound that pierced through the Chancellor's rhetoric. "You are not protecting an empire," she said, her eyes meeting the officials with a dignity that made him flinch. "You are only protecting your own fear of being small." The words were a strike more effective than any sword, exposing the hollow core of the men who stood before them. Severian felt a surge of pride that nearly brought him to his knees. The girl he had rejected for being purposeless was the only one in the entire capital with the courage to speak the truth. She was no longer a victim of the Empire's cruelty. She was the mirror in which its rot was finally being reflected for all to see. The Chancellor's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, and he gave the order for the guards to advance. But as the first soldier stepped forward, the ground beneath them seemed to shudder with the sound of the palace's outer gates being breached by the starving, angry masses. The wall between the powerful and the invisible was finally collapsing, and the ghosts of the city were coming to reclaim what was theirs. Severian looked at Elara, a silent communication passing between them that transcended the chaos. They were no longer an emperor and an orphan. They were two people standing on the edge of a dying world, realizing that the only thing that mattered was the heat of the hand they were holding. The sound of the splintering gates was like the first crack in a dam before the flood. Severian watched as the guards hesitated, their eyes darting between the command of their masters and the encroaching roar of the people they had long oppressed. The Chancellor's face paled, the realization dawning on him that the wall of fear he had helped build around the throne was finally being scaled by those with nothing left to lose. Severian felt no triumph in this collapse, only a profound sense of inevitability. He had ruled by the sword and by the cold calculation of human worth, and now the very people he had treated as numbers were coming to settle the debt. In the midst of the escalating panic, the Chancellor reached for his own dagger, a desperate and cowardly move intended for Elara, the girl he still blamed for the end of his world. Severian moved with a speed born of a lifetime of combat, his arm sweeping out to intercept the blow. The blade bit deep into the Emperor's forearm, the crimson blood staining his golden embroidery. But he didn't even flinch. He disarmed the older man with a brutal, efficient twist, casting the dagger into the dirt. He didn't kill him. He simply looked at him with a pity that was far more devastating than a death sentence, realizing that the Chancellor was a man who would die in the dark, still clutching the ghost of a power that no longer existed. The mob poured into the gardens like a tidal wave, their faces a blur of rage and desperation. For a moment, it seemed they would tear everyone apart, the emperor included. But as the crowd surged forward, they stopped at the sight of Severian standing protectively over Elara, his own blood dripping onto the white marble. He didn't raise his sword. He didn't call for his guards. He simply stood there, a broken king shielding a girl who looked like one of them. The silence that followed was heavy, a shared breath between the top of the mountain and the bottom of the valley. In that moment, the people didn't see a god. They saw a man who was bleeding for someone who had once been invisible. Elara stepped forward, moving out from behind Severian's protective shadow. She walked toward the front line of the protesters, her hand outstretched, her presence a calm center in the eye of the storm. She had lived her life in their alleys. She had shared their hunger and their silence. When she spoke, her voice wasn't a command, but a bridge. She told them that the palace was not their enemy, but the greed that had hollowed it out from the inside. She spoke of the man behind her not as an emperor, but as someone who had finally learned that a throne is only as strong as the heart of the person it serves. The crowd's rage didn't vanish, but it transformed into a somber, watchful recognition. Severian felt the last of his imperial identity slip away, and for the first time, he didn't reach out to grab it. He looked at his empire, now a garden filled with the very people he had spent a lifetime avoiding, and he felt a strange, terrifying freedom. He was no longer the great emperor Severian Kael. He was a man standing in the wreckage of his own life, holding the hand of a woman who had taught him how to see. The crisis had reached its peak, and while the crown lay forgotten in the mud, the truth of his regret had finally been laid bare. He had lost his world, but as he looked at Elara, he realized he had finally found his soul. The aftermath of the uprising left the palace gardens a landscape of shattered glass and cooling embers. Severian sat on the edge of a marble fountain, his royal robes torn and his wounded arm bound in a strip of linen Elara had torn from her own dress. The High Council had fled into the night, their titles and treasures meaning nothing in a world that had finally stopped fearing them. Severian looked at his hands, the hands that had signed the death warrants of cities and the rejection of the only soul that mattered, and saw they were trembling. He was no longer a sovereign, he was a survivor, and the silence of the night felt like a heavy, judging weight on his tired shoulders. Elara sat beside him, her presence the only constant in the ruin of his life. She didn't look at the burning tapestries or the broken statues. She looked at the stars, the same stars Severian had once used to teach her about distance and coldness. She knew that the man beside her was grieving for a version of himself that had finally died, and she did not rush to comfort him with false words. She had learned long ago that the most profound transformations happen in the quiet, in the moments when you realize that everything you thought gave you value was merely a shadow. She was no longer the girl no one wanted, but she was still the girl who understood the language of the broken. A sudden, sharp realization hit Severian as he looked at the silhouette of the capital against the orange sky. He had believed that his regret was something he could fix with a grand gesture or a sudden change of heart, but he saw now that regret was a permanent scar on the soul. He had rejected Elara when she was at her most vulnerable, and although they were now together in the wreckage, the memory of that coldness would always be a part of their story. He turned to her, the firelight reflecting in his dark, hollow eyes, and asked the question that had been haunting him since the first snow fell. Can you ever truly forgive a man who only saw your worth after he lost his own? Elara turned her gaze from the sky to his face, her expression a mix of sorrow and a newfound, fierce clarity. She reached out and touched the scar on his forearm, the mark of the blade he had taken for her. She told him that forgiveness was not a gift you give to someone else, but a choice you make to stop living in the past. She had forgiven him not because he was an emperor, but because he was the first person who had ever looked at her and seen a human being worth bleeding for. The power dynamic that had once defined them was gone, replaced by a raw, painful equality that was more terrifying than any crown. As the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, Severian stood up, pulling Elara with him. The palace was no longer a home. It was a museum of a dead era. He looked at the throne room through the shattered doors, seeing the golden chair standing solitary and absurd in the middle of the dust. He realized that the only way to truly honor his regret was to walk away from the symbol of the man who had caused it. He took Elara's hand, his grip firm and desperate, and began to walk toward the gates. He was leaving behind an empire, but for the first time in 45 years, he was walking toward a future that didn't feel like a sentence. The journey away from the palace was a descent into a reality Severian had never known. For miles, they walked through the outskirts of the capital, witnessing the skeletal remains of a system that had favored the few while starving the many. Severian saw his own face reflected in the hollow eyes of the people on the streets, no longer as a god to be feared, but as a ghost of a failing era. He felt the urge to hide his face, to pull his cloak tighter and disappear into the shadows, but Elara's hand remained a steady, grounding weight in his. She did not let him hide. She forced him to look at the world he had created, ensuring that his repentance was not just a feeling, but a confrontation with the truth. As they reached the edge of the great forest that bordered the Imperial Valley, Severian stopped to look back at the distant, shimmering towers of his city. He felt a phantom ache in his temples where the crown used to sit, a psychological weight that was harder to shed than the gold itself. He wondered if the empire would descend into a century of darkness, or if something better would grow from the ashes he had left behind. Elara stood beside him, her hair caught in the morning breeze, looking not at the past, but at the path ahead. She was no longer the girl who waited to be told she had a purpose. She was the one guiding the man who had once tried to deny her a place in the world. The transition from absolute power to absolute anonymity was a violent shock to Severian's soul. In the small, quiet village where they finally sought refuge, he had to learn the value of things that had once seemed beneath him: the warmth of a shared meal, the labor of hands working the earth, and the terrifying vulnerability of being just another man. He found that without his titles, he was a clumsy, uncertain creature, struggling to find his footing in a world that didn't care for his commands. Elara watched him with a patient, watchful eye, helping him navigate the complexities of a life where importance was measured in kindness rather than in territory. However, the shadow of his past reign was not so easily outrun. News reached their quiet haven that the empire was fracturing into warring states, each led by a former general or council member claiming to be Severian's true successor. The people were suffering more than ever, caught in the crossfire of men who wanted the throne, but possessed none of the emperor's former, albeit cold, sense of order. Severian sat by the fire one evening, the weight of his legacy pressing down on him once more. He realized that simply walking away wasn't enough. He had left a vacuum of power that was now being filled by monsters far worse than the man he used to be. The choice to be just a man was a luxury his history would not allow. He looked at Elara, seeing the peace she had found in their simple life, and he felt a devastating sense of guilt. He knew that if he returned to the world to try and mend what he had broken, he would be putting her back into the line of fire. But he also knew that Elara would never respect a man who sat in comfort while the world burned because of his mistakes. The final crisis was not a battle of swords, but a battle of conscience. He had to decide if his redemption required him to stay in the light with her, or to step back into the gray shadows of leadership to ensure that no other girl would ever be rejected as she had been. The decision to leave the sanctuary of the forest was the hardest command Severian ever had to give, but this time, he didn't give it as a ruler. He gave it as a man seeking to balance a heavy scale. He sat Elara down beneath the ancient oaks and spoke of the chaos spreading across the valley, admitting that his peace was built on a foundation of others' suffering. He expected her to plead with him to stay, to remind him of the life they had just begun to build, but Elara simply took his hand and placed it over her heart. She told him that she hadn't fallen in love with a king, but with a man who was finally brave enough to care about the invisible. She would not let him go back alone. She would be the conscience he had once tried to silence, walking beside him into the fire. They returned to the capital not with an army, but with a truth that was more powerful than any siege engine. As they entered the city, Severian didn't head for the palace. He went to the central square where the people gathered in their hunger and fear. He stood before them, stripped of his golden armor and his obsidian crown, and he did something no emperor of the Kael line had ever done. He knelt. He apologized to the people he had ignored and the girl he had rejected, his voice carrying across the silent crowd with a raw, unpolished honesty. He didn't ask for his throne back. He asked for the chance to serve as the architect of their recovery, offering his strategic mind to mend the systems he had allowed to rot. The former generals and counselors who had seized the palace watched from the balconies with sneers of contempt, believing that Severian had truly lost his mind. They sent the guard to arrest the madman, but the soldiers stopped when they saw the wall of people forming a human shield around the former emperor and the girl in the linen dress. The power of the throne had always been a collective illusion, a ghost sustained by the obedience of the masses, and in that moment, the ghost finally dissipated. The people realized that the men in the palace were only as powerful as the fear they could instill, and they no longer feared men who were smaller than the humble pair standing in the mud of the square. Severian spent the following months working in the streets, using his knowledge of logistics to organize food distribution and his understanding of law to establish local councils. He lived in a small house near the archives, refusing the luxuries of the palace which he had ordered to be converted into a public hospital and school. Every evening he would return home to find Elara waiting, her presence a reminder that his worth was no longer tied to the number of provinces he held, but to the depth of the peace he helped create. He was still a man of iron and logic, but the iron was now a support beam for others, and his logic was tempered by a compassion that Elara had planted in the barren soil of his soul. Yet the transformation was most visible in the way he looked at her when the world wasn't watching. The cold, distant emperor who had once rejected her was gone, replaced by a man who cherished the sound of her laughter more than the sound of trumpets. He realized that his life's greatest achievement wasn't the empire he had built, but the bridge he had constructed back to his own humanity. The regret that had once threatened to crush his throne had become the very thing that anchored him to reality, a constant reminder that the most insignificant person in the eyes of the world can be the very foundation of a man's entire universe. As the years softened the jagged edges of the past, the capital transformed into a city that no longer lived in the shadow of a throne, but in the light of a shared purpose. Severian and Elara walked through the gardens of the former palace, which were now overflowing with the laughter of children and the quiet conversations of scholars. The great emperor had become a title mentioned only in history books, a cautionary tale of a man who almost lost his soul to the coldness of a crown. Severian himself felt the weight of his age, but his steps were lighter than they had ever been during his reign. He looked at the woman beside him, whose hair was now touched with silver, but whose eyes still held the same profound, steady light that had once brought him to his knees in the darkness of a dungeon. The empire had not fallen into the ruin he had once feared. Instead, it had been reborn into something far more resilient because it was built on the visibility of every soul within its borders. Severian realized that the crumbling of his throne was the greatest mercy he had ever received, a necessary destruction that had cleared the way for a life of genuine meaning. He no longer needed to be a god to feel important. He only needed to be the man who made sure Elara was warm at night and that the city they loved was just. The regret that had once been a poison in his veins had long ago distilled into a deep, abiding gratitude, a constant reminder that even the most absolute power is nothing compared to the strength of a single, honest connection. In the quiet hours of the evening, they sat on a stone bench overlooking the valley, watching the lights of the city flicker on like fallen stars. Severian took Elara's hand, his fingers tracing the familiar lines of her palm, and felt a peace so profound it almost felt like a prayer. He remembered the day he had rejected her, the day he thought he was choosing strength over weakness, and he marveled at the blind arrogance of that younger man. He saw now that he hadn't been rejecting a girl. He had been rejecting his own heart, and the fact that she had stayed to help him find it was a miracle he would never stop trying to deserve. The girl no one wanted had become the only person he could never live without. Their story was whispered in the taverns and taught in the schools, not as a romance of kings and queens, but as a testament to the power of seeing and being seen. It was a reminder that the tallest towers are the ones most likely to fall, while the humble roots in the earth are the ones that endure the storm. Severian looked at Elara, and for the first time in his long life, he didn't feel the need to look away or to hide behind a mask of authority. He was seen, fully and completely, with all his scars and his history of coldness, and he was still loved. That, he realized, was the only true sovereignty a human being could ever achieve. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long golden glow over the world they had helped mend, Severian leaned in and whispered his final surrender into the silence. He told her that he had spent his life building walls, only to find that the only thing worth having was the person who had the patience to wait until they fell. Elara smiled, a radiant, effortless expression that was his ultimate reward, and rested her head on his shoulder. The great emperor and the invisible girl had vanished, leaving behind only two people who had found their way home through the wreckage of a kingdom. The throne was gone, the empire was changed, but as the stars began to shine, their love remained, the only thing that had never truly been a burden.